Infrastructure is the cornerstone of connectivity, said Chinese President Xi Jinping in a keynote speech on Friday to leaders from around the world. How will this guide China's actions under the Belt and Road Initiative moving forward? And how does the United Nations see the links between the Belt and Road Initiative and the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development? I sat down with the UN resident coordinator in China to find out. Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. High-quality infrastructure, sustainability, risk resilience, reasonable pricing and inclusiveness. These are some of the key words emphasized by Chinese President Xi Jinping during his keynote speech on Friday at the opening ceremony of the second Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation that is ongoing in the Chinese capital. So what were the major takeaways from his speech? Did he adequately address some of the concerns that have been expressed by some in the international community surrounding the Belt and Road Initiative? I'm pleased to be joined by Arancha González, who had a front row seat in the meeting this morning. She is the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, or ITC, an organization jointly set up by the United Nations and the World Trade Organization to facilitate trade around the world, and Professor Thye, Professor of Economics at the University of California, Davis, and an advisor for the Center for China and Globalization, a think tank based in Beijing. Thank you so much and welcome to The Point. Let me start with you, Arancha. It's great to have you. The first time you were here in the studio to talk about the last and the first Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. Now that you're back 2 years later, from President Xi's speech earlier today, what is the biggest impression that you have that is different from the first time?
Well, I think the main takeaway for me is that President Xi Jinping has been listening. He's been listening to those that said that connectivity infrastructure is not enough, that you have to qualify it. It has to be environmentally sustainable. It has to be financially viable. It has to be financed without corruption. All of this that he heard is what he has now introduced into the Belt and Road Initiative. The second takeaway for me is that he has also heard questions about reform and opening in China, and he's been very clear about the path that China will continue to take, which is an essential ingredient to the success of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China keeping its markets open, China welcoming foreign investment, China playing by the rules of international trade. So from this point of view, I think the messages were clear.
How do you see the tone of all of these messages? I watched it. He was delivering in a very matter-of-factly way, and he was not giving too many numbers. Actually, the speech was relatively short and concise. But how do you see the tone and the reaction from the other delegates who were next to you listening to the speech?
I think the messages were all the good messages, and the reaction from people in the room was, that's exactly what needs to happen. Obviously, the question now is whether it happens or not. And the cynics will tell you, well, these are only words, and we would only know when this happens on the ground. But I tend to think that when a Chinese leader says something, the Chinese leader tends to do it. So I am optimistic that he will now deliver on all the questions, comments, arguments that he raised
today. What about the track record? Let me just follow up on this question before I go to Professor Wu, because you can only know the future if you judge from the past. You were here during the first summit. You talked about the potential of the Belt and Road Initiative. 2 years on, are there any substantive evidence that you have witnessed that can give you enough confidence that the Chinese are delivering what they promise?
Well, I think there is lots of micro-evidence, but there is also two figures that stand out that, in my view, reflect that they are sincere when they say they want to welcome others in China. First, exports from Belt and Road partners to China have grown faster than exports from non-Belt and Road partners. Two, investments into Belt and Road partners have grown faster than investments in non-Belt and Road partners. So in my view, it's a signal that there is sincerity in this initiative to facilitate more trade and investment between the partners of the Belt and Road. But of course, this is not a program for 2 years.
No.
This is a program for decades to come. So for me, the question now is seeing this clear sense of direction expressed by President Xi Jinping happen on the ground year after year.
Professor Wu, what has been your catchphrase, let's say? What is the catchphrase that caught your attention in the speech, and why?
There are two catchphrases that caught my attention. The first is high quality infrastructure. And I think, to me, that means that China will help put up green infrastructure in the rest of the world. In other words, the construction of power plants that China has been involved in. I think there will have to be a more concerted effort now to make sure that that the country would have defossilization of its energy system. And the second thing that is a logical implication of that is that cities have to become more sustainable. And so this move to establish a coalition of sustainable cities is a very good one.
Yeah.
And I think that there was one more thing that he heard from the rest of the world since the last Belt Road Conference, and which he has incorporated now, is that infrastructure now is not just hard infrastructure, but soft infrastructure as well. Because he talked about 5,000 visitors being brought over here for training. And on that front, I think China is in a position to do a lot more. Like, for example, China's leading universities should partner with the leading university in every Belt Road country that is of developing country status, and bring their engineering departments up to snuff.
Yeah.
And especially in the area of digital connectivity.
How do you look at the phase that we're entering, though? Because President Xi clearly emphasized high quality, clearly emphasized sustainability, clearly emphasized environmental implication and people-to-people exchanges and innovation. It seems that we are entering a different phase of this project. How would you describe it, and how much of a challenge is there? Because on some of these issues, even China is still trying to find solutions, in terms of environmental protection. Although we have done some good things, our environment is still not up to par to our standards. So, Arancha, how would you describe the phase we are now entering for this initiative?
In my view, there will be greater granularity and greater scrutiny. So if the first phase was all about, okay, let's launch initiatives and let's just go and do started,
yeah.
Now it's going to be much more about, let's first check if what we plan to do makes sense, makes financial sense, if it is green, if it adds, if it is as a complement to other initiatives, so that there is no crowding out. So there is going to be much more granularity. The second thing is, in my view, there's going to be more private sector. One of the things that happened during this Belt and Road Forum was a CEO gathering, a gathering of business that has to be an essential ingredient to anchor the long-term sustainability of the investments that are being made by the public sector, by governments. So these two ingredients would, in my view, be essential to the future.
Professor Wu, your take?
I think the lesson of the cancellation of projects in Malaysia after the change in government really brings home the point that President Xi is much respected by the rest of the world because of his vigorous prosecution of corruption. Now, how can we keep Belt and Road projects untainted, not associated with the corruption in the host countries? And as you know, in Malaysia, Najib Razak is under trial for kleptocracy. And in the projects that would be approved during his time, had a lot of side payments to his cronies. And so it was not anti-China that the projects were cancelled, but because they were associated with acts that in China would not be acceptable either.
So it's What would you say for the kind of challenges that we're faced with? Because we're not just talking about one country, we're talking about 126 countries by now, and the great majority of them, or basically all of them, are countries which need development, which have still a lot to improve in terms of governance.
Helping other countries is always difficult. One of the key is to know what is it they want, and how can one implement it well in the specific conditions of the country. And I think China has to boost up its knowledge about the rest of the world.
What kind of implications will the second phase, will the newer phase of Belt and Road Initiative have for the other parts of the world, for the countries that are joining, that have already joined this initiative? Will it mean greater trade, greater personnel flow, but greater services flow with China? Will it mean stepped up governance? Will it mean more sustainable approach to economic development? Arancha, how do you look at the other side of the story?
I look at it in terms of complementarity. The partners are looking at diverse sources to boost their development. China is one source, America is another source, the European Union is another source, multilateral development banks are other sources. So I think partners are looking at this as a complementary to overall efforts to foster development. And I think what is important, and I heard this a lot in the summit, not only from President Xi Jinping, but also from the other presidents, that this has to be done in the spirit of partnership, understanding what the other one wants, and being able to tell the other one yes or no if it doesn't make sense. So being honest in the conversation is, in my view, what would make a lot of sense.
Professor Wu, your take on the question: what will be the implication for the countries such as Malaysia or such as other countries in Africa when China is entering this phase of higher quality development of projects in the Belt and Road Initiative?
As you could see, the Prime Minister of Malaysia is here, and he has made it very clear that he thinks that China has learned a lot from its first phase of the BRI program, and is entering into a phase where I think the concerns of the country are taken more seriously, and furthermore, the rest of the world are looking at China to see how the WTO's reforms would go.
Yeah.
Because the US-China trade war is effectively an attempt to change the WTO system.
Just being the devil's advocate, do you think the world also, or the other countries also need to meet China halfway? Because this is not just China going out and catering to everybody's needs. You know, what about the host countries? Do they think they also need to upgrade their mentality as well, Professor Wu?
Oh, part of it is whenever you see an objection against what China is doing, they would say it's not financially viable because that's a very unstable country. No private sector would go in. But that is like the chicken and egg question. Without economic development, how could there be political stability? That you have to build stakeholders in the system. So what the Chinese are doing, they are going in to create the economic conditions on which it will be easier to build political stability in the future.
All right. My last question, real fast, Arancha, in terms of facilitating trade, how has this initiative benefited the countries and the people that you have been trying to help?
Very clear benefits for the 100 SMEs that we brought to Shanghai to the Import Expo last year. Tangible results. For the 100 companies in China that we've connected to investment opportunities in Africa, very clear results, and a number of them were signed this morning, for example, in Ethiopia. But I think the message I take on trade is a very strong signal from China that it will continue to open its markets, it will continue to reform its economy, and that it will continue to support a stronger multilateral trading system with a strong reform of the WTO.
Thank you very much. My two guests, Arancha González, the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, and Professor Thye, Professor of Economics at the University of California, Davis, and an advisor to the Center for China and Globalization.